One of the rare occasions that white people are honest with themselves and honest with the world and self-reflective is when they create movies. They always seem to put the truth in the movies. Maybe because it's less personal, it's less accusatory of white people, but they always seem to put in their movies, how things really are. Right? I've talked about that, and there has been one white man who wrote an article about this, about how white people always put themselves in a position of power, even when they're narrating the minority experience. It's either there's got to be a white savior, or if the white person becomes the minority person, they're the savior internally. And I talked about this before with movies like Avatar, The Last Samurai, Dances with Wolves, and Enemy Mine. You could also throw in Fern Gully and the Last Rainforest if you want to say that one. But the only movie where a white man came into a situation, and that movie was generally about race, which was the District 9 with the aliens in South Africa, and they just basically took the aliens and replaced the blacks with the aliens, having the aliens live in the Soweto and the ghetto, as opposed to having the blacks there, and then saying it's that humans are the ones that are being racially oppressive, and the aliens, because this is not their planet, they're the ones that are forced, to live in the ghettos. And, they made the alien ship in the movie was essentially a slave ship, or so they hinted at, that, was basically controlled by another group of aliens. So basically, the aliens that were slaves to another group of aliens hijacked the ship, and basically, the nearest planet or whatever they could find that was hospitable was Earth, and then they, landed on Earth. And so, it was an interesting, twist, on aliens and race, and, as opposed to aliens coming down and, conquering humanity. I like that movie just for the creative angle of the movie. And then, the sci-fi effects were pretty cool, and the CGI and all that stuff. But the concept, I really wish that concept really got fleshed out. That was one of the few movies that I was really excited to go see when it came out. I wanted to know what it was all about, because it only gave little hints. It didn't really explain much. But there's another movie that I'm going to discuss, and this is just the intro to the video that I'm going to do, called Charlie Wilson's War, starring Tom Hanks. And there's a scene in the movie, and I'll play the scene. There's a scene in the movie where Tom Hanks's character, Charlie Wilson, basically wanted to create schools in Afghanistan. Now, I don't know all the details of the war in Afghanistan, but I think it goes something like this, and you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But basically, the U.S. was having one of its proxy wars with the Russians, and the U.S. was basically trying to prevent Russia from expanding into Afghanistan, right? They say Afghanistan is the country where nations go off to die, right? Because the terrain is inhospitable and rocky and mountainous, and it's controlled by, there's no centralized government. It's controlled by tribal warlords, right? And one of the groups that the U.S. went in and actually gave a whole bunch of weapons and guns and armed to help fight the Russians, same way the U.S. went into Vietnam, same way the U.S. went into South Korea, right? So this is all CIA. And again, America, after Vietnam, America didn't like wars, so the U.S. government had to find more creative ways to wage war um, without, getting, approval from Congress, right? So they could basically act as proxies and act as intermediaries and, get the rebels or whatever group that they're supporting the weapons. And that's what the U.S. did. Um, this is the same situation that you saw with the dumping of narcotics and drugs underneath Reagan and Oliver North, who I believe was director of the CIA at the time, and got arrested and then was pardoned by Bush. But the dumping of drugs in the black community to fund the Nicaragua Contras. So since the U.S. couldn't get the funding, the president couldn't get the funding to contain communism, he went the backdoor route. Now you can go online, Wikipedia, I don't know all the details, but there was this situation between Iran, the Contras in Nicaragua, containing communism, and then the CIA, bringing drugs and smuggling them into, the streets of urban environments in black inner city America, which essentially created the what do you call it? The inner city ghetto gang related street culture, hip hop culture that we see today. Right? But you're not going to hear white people take accountability for that. With the whole aspect of the heroin surge followed by the crack cocaine era. All right, you're not going to hear them take accountability for that. They're just going to say, oh, those black people, they're just the way that they are. We didn't do anything to facilitate their downfall or, make the situation worse that was already pretty bad for them, which I'm going to get into later on in this video. Or I'm going to let somebody else break it down, and then I'm going to give my commentary and basically translate and put it in layman's terms and really highlight what a lot of people, don't pick up on. But, that's what the U.S. government, does. So Charlie Wilson's war, the U.S. supported, I believe it was the Mujahideen, which later became and evolved into Al-Qaeda, or had factions that broke off and became Al-Qaeda. And Charlie Wilson, he was the person that oversaw the whole thing. And you're going to see in this scene, as they're reenacting the scene, Tom Hanks is telling them, like, we need to build a school. We went in there, we did all this, we wanted to contain communism, everything. And this is like when everything's supposedly, done and over with. And there's actually another scene at the end of the movie, where they talk about, the crazies, are starting to rise up, which is what Charlie Wilson was trying to prevent. And, Tom Hanks' character, Charlie Wilson, he's like, let me build some schools, so that we can, not leave a vacuum. That's the best way to put it. Because when you leave a vacuum, there's no telling, what's going to evolve out of that. And if it's a situation of desperation, a situation of poverty, a situation of a lack of resources, then chances are the culture that's going to evolve out of those conditions is going to be very negative. And this is essentially what has happened in the black community. And white people take no responsibility for that. None. And, these movies portray white people skirting that responsibility, white people as a collective, because it's their society, it's their government as the collective, not any individual white person, as a collective. Because obviously you can see, as Charlie Wilson was portrayed in this movie, he was trying to prevent that. And there have been white men throughout history who have tried to prevent that, here and there, but, nothing that would um, undermine the system of white supremacy. Like when people talk about, what was his name, the abolitionist Jim Brown. When people talk about him, obviously that's one man going up against the whole institution of slavery that many white people are benefiting from. And so, what I always find interesting is, most white people, they'll say that they're Christians. They're Christians. And they love them some white Jesus. And they'll say, Jesus died for our sins. Jesus died for the sins of all of mankind, right? They'll jump up and they'll say that, right? And first off, I want you to think about the arrogance of that. Jesus died for the sins of all of mankind, even the people that don't even know about Jesus because they're worshiping their own religions that are far older than Christianity, and Christianity basically plagiarized from. But let's not go down that route, okay? But they'll say Jesus died for, all of our sins. But yet when we get to talking about slavery and we talk about reparations, first thing out of most white people's mouths is that I didn't own any slaves. Therefore, I don't owe black people anything. That's usually how it goes, right? Despite the fact that, with the system of slavery, they were the beneficiaries of slavery that, basically, created, America, right? All that free labor, all of that wealth, right? When you have the world's resources at your disposal, or you have other people doing all the work, that frees up a whole bunch of time. Now you can go and you can study, or you can, be artistic, or you can excel in other areas because your basic needs are taken care of because you're letting the slaves do all that stuff, right? So you make an astronomical leap forward in terms of technological advancements and other things, and kids go to universities and all that stuff and institutions, right, where you can now focus on pontification. It's hard to focus on pontificating when you're this hunter-gatherer people and you're trying to figure out where your next meal is, right? So it's not until you have groups of people that are exploited to do all the labor that you have those who are just as ruthless as they are intellectual, that frees them up the time to go off and, advance. What I notice about white folks, and when they bring up, Christianity, is in other words, they have a problem with the idea of paying for the sins of the father, right? But not the problem with the idea of the father paying for the sins of the child. But that's not how it plays out. Because when you look at how white supremacy works, right, it just keeps kicking the can down the road, right? In other words, the founding fathers, the men that you see in the Charlie Wilson's war clip.
$1 million for school reconstruction?
Oh, shit, Charlie.
Listen.
It's like the congressman from Kabul.
Did you hear me say it was $1 million, not $1 billion, for school construction?
We heard you. Everybody heard you, buddy. They heard you in Dover, Delaware.
Well, I sure hope I'm not annoying you, Bob, because that's the last thing I want to do.
Look.
I was in the Roosevelt room with the president last week. You know what he said? He said Afghanistan. Is that still going on?
Well, it is. Half the population of that country is under the age of 14. Half the population is under the age of 14. Now, think how fucking dangerous that is. They're going to come home and find their families are dead. Their villages have been napalmed.
And we helped kill the guys who did it.
Yeah, but they don't know that, Bob, because they don't get home delivery of the New York Times. But even if they did, it was covert, remember? This is what we always do. We always go in with our ideals and we change the world. And then we leave. We always leave. But that ball, though, It keeps on bouncing.
What?
The ball keeps on bouncing.
Yeah, we're a little busy right now reorganizing Eastern Europe, don't you think?
We've spent billions. Let's spend $1 million on HR 118 and rebuild the school.
Charlie, nobody gives a shit about a school in Pakistan.
Afghanistan.
Right? They're kicking the can down the road. Not my problem. Right? But we see what happened with kicking the can down the road, especially on this situation with Charlie Wilson's war and the situation with Afghanistan, and a guy, with a turban coming out of Saudi Arabia and moving to Afghanistan and the Pakistan border and basically capitalizing on the vacuum that the United States left. But see, your average white person doesn't understand this. Your average white person thinks that 9/11, happened out of a vacuum. People got all type of conspiracy theories left and right and all this other stuff. But there's no doubt about it, that Afghanistan and 9/11 are intimately connected. And this clip highlights what happens when you ignore responsibility. You ignore a problem that you created and you think that you can walk away from it, without having to pay the cost. And you simply kick the can down the road onto your children. Those people who died during 9/11, they can pretty much thank those people that were sitting in the room with Charlie Wilson, who denied his ability to go into Afghanistan and spend a measly $2 million to build a school. Hell, in the movie clip, he reduced it down to $1 million. But this is what he wanted to do, and they said no. And then next thing you know, you got a bunch of 19 guys on a plane with box cutters screaming Allahu Akbar, slamming planes into a building. You see? And so, when it comes to race relations in America, I see it very much the same way. When it comes to slavery and, Jim Crow and all the things that have negatively affected the black community, redlining, blockbusting, the lack of access to Social Security for the first 20 years, arguably the Homestead Act, although that land was taken from Native Americans, right? The dumping of drugs in the black community, eminent domain, urban renewal, the 1956 Highway Commission Act. I mean, all of these things just compounded. I mean, just no way. It's like black people come out of slavery with nothing but the clothes on their back, right? And then people telling them, pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, and they don't even have boots, right? And then all they can do is basically work for white people, right? Because white people control the infrastructure. And then when it comes to the idea of building wealth, or which is, intimately tied to ownership, you have situations like eminent domain. I highly doubt that those black people who lost those homes, the few who did own their properties, I highly doubt that they were justly compensated, for, their property. Remember, much of the wealth in America is transferred through home ownership. And so without that, you're already behind, aside from the fact that you're denied access to loans via, redlining, and banks basically saying anybody who lives in this area, we're not giving you loans, so we're cutting you off from capital, so therefore you can't start businesses and own businesses. The black community, quiet as it's kept, was doing much better underneath segregation than after desegregation. I don't want to call it integration because it wasn't truly integrated. We integrated socially, but we did not integrate economically. And that was the next phase of the civil rights movement. And so I'll let that be the segue into the second half of this video. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to play the video, I'm just going to play the audio. but it is of Martin Luther King. I think 11 months before he died, before he was assassinated. Let me be clear about that. And as I've said numerous times, I think Martin Luther King was killed because he was talking about that money situation. Same reason why Gaddafi was taken out, because he was talking about the Mataba conference and going to a gold dinar. Anytime you go in there and you fucking with that Rothschild's money, they're going to take you the fuck out. You know, you see the same thing with the Bitcoin people. Anytime you start talking about, hey, this system doesn't work for me, you know, the economics don't work for me, and you go up against the centralized banks, they'll find some reason or justification to take you out individually or take you out as a nation or as a leader of a nation, which is what happened with Gaddafi. Go look up the Mataba conference. You know, they've been pulling information on that for a while. One of the only video clips that were on YouTube, I don't know if it's still up there, was from Russia TV. It's one of the few clips that talked about the Mataba conference, where basically Gaddafi was trying to create the United States of Africa. And he was trying to get the African nations and the Arab nations to come together. Because remember, one of the things that only keep the U.S. economy afloat is the fact that the Saudis trade their oil in U.S. dollars. Remember that the U.S. government has switched to fractional reserve banking. It is, you know, the dollar is nothing more than a fiat currency. It doesn't have a direct value as it pertains to gold. So it's just paper, which is one of the things that this whole financial crisis is really undermining, because, you know, they don't want to just keep printing money and, you know, putting money out there, because if people start losing faith in the system and realize that the whole banking system is a sham, that's going to be a problem, you see. But, you know, you can look at some of the people who were the innovators of Bitcoin, and they went missing. They disappeared. And there's other, you know, Litecoin, Ethereal. There's other coins and stuff that have very mysterious, you know, they're the people who came up with it, very mysterious deaths, very mysterious disappearances. Some people say, oh, they ran off with the money and cashed out and stuff like that. But it's very, very strange. If you ever want to look into some conspiracy theories, look into that stuff, right? But, you know, the point that I'm making is one about, you know, when it comes down to the money, that's where there's a problem. And you're going to hear the man who immediately, when he starts speaking, you're going to know who it is, goes right into that. And see, these are the speeches that, you know, America doesn't want this man to be remembered for. They want this man to be remembered for all of the social stuff, the kumbaya, the religious aspects, the hold hands and come together and we're all God's children and we're all Christians. That's what America wants you to remember this man for. You know, but unlike many of the religious people that I argue with in the black community today, this man was, remember, you know, he had his doctorate. This man was a highly learned individual who, yes, he may have been a man of faith, but by the same token, he was also very, you know, a very calculating person. You know, it's not, you know, just all magic. It's not just all feelings. And you're going to hear that. So anyway, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say. So without further ado, I will go into part 2. So the fan on my computer is extremely loud because my computer is hot right now, knocking stuff over. So this is what I'm gonna do. I turned up the volume. I got it on my TV monitor. And so we'll see if we can do this. I'll see how the sound comes out. I might have to clear out the background noise, but we'll see.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went out from here into university and then you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. Now, of course, that particular struggle and that philosophy centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. So I would say that in that period, the basic thrust for the gaining of citizenship rights for Negroes was to end the humiliation surrounding the whole system of legal segregation.
Hold on one second. I gotta move this slider over real quick.
Dr. King, was there something peculiar to the place where you started and the kind of people you attracted? I mean by that, there was a strong attachment on the part of your parishioners in Montgomery to the church. They were older people, weren't they?
Yes, I would say by and large they were older people who participated in the boycott because they were the ones using the bus more than anybody else. And Montgomery was a community predominantly church-centered, so that it was very easy to get to the vast majority of Negroes because they were in some way connected with a church in the community.
Sir, in addition to your commitment to the idea of nonviolence, wasn't it also the only thing you could do, the white community having the monopoly on violence, that if you had tried violence, they would have met it with violence? It was the only device open to you, wasn't it?
Well, I'll put it another way, that morally, I was led to nonviolence because I felt that it was the best moral way to deal with the problem. We were seeking to establish a just society. And it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that violence is certainly much more socially destructive, and it creates many more social problems than it solves. So I was led to nonviolence for deep moral reasons. Now, there is no doubt about the fact that in our struggle in Montgomery and all over the United States for that matter, nonviolence is also practically sound. It would just be impractical for the Negro to turn to violence. He has neither the instruments nor the techniques of violence. We are about 10 or 11% of the total population of the nation, and I would say we're about 1/10 of the firepower. So it would just be totally impractical and unwise and unrealistic for the Negro to think of violence. Well, I saw this in the beginning in Montgomery, but this wasn't the basic reason that I turned to nonviolence and that I believed in it as a philosophy. I turned to it because I felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
You know what that clip sounds like right there? You know what it sounds like, right? Well, I believe it's hard winning a war with words, gentlemen. You know, there's not a cannon factory in the whole South.
The situation's very simple. The Yankees can't fight and we can.
You're right. It won't even be a battle, that's what I think. They'll just turn and run every time.
One Southerner can lick 20 Yankees.
Why, we'll finish him in one battle. Gentlemen can always fight better than rattle.
Yes, gentlemen always fight better than rabble.
And what does the captain of our troop say?
Well, gentlemen, if Georgia fights, I go with her. But like my father, I hope that the Yankees will let us leave the Union in peace.
But Ashley, they've insulted us. You can't mean you don't want war.
Most of the miseries of the world were caused by wars. And when the wars were over, No one ever knew what they were about.
Why, actually, if it wasn't...
No, gentlemen. Mr. Butler's been up north, I hear. Don't you agree with this, Mr. Butler?
I think it's hard winning a war with words, gentlemen.
What do you mean, sir?
I mean, Mr. Hamilton, there's not a cannon factory in the whole South.
What difference does that make, sir, to a gentleman?
I'm afraid it's going to make a great deal of difference to a great many gentlemen, sir.
Are you hinting, Mr. Butler, that the Yankees can lick us?
No, I'm not hinting. I'm saying very plainly that the Yankees are better equipped than we. They've got factories, shipyards, coal mines, and a fleet to bottle up our harbors and starve us to death. All we've got is cotton and slaves and arrogance.
That's treacherous, sir. I refuse to listen to any renegade talk.
I'm sorry if the truth offends you.
Apologies aren't enough, sir. I hear you were turned out of West Point, Mr. Red Butler, and that you aren't received any decent family in Charleston, not even your own.
I apologize again for all my shortcomings. Mr. Wilkes, perhaps you won't mind if I walk about and look over your place. I seem to be spoiling everybody's brandy and cigars and dreams of victory.
Is there something about nonviolence that made it, and I use that in the past tense, that made it more useful among Southern Negroes than the ghetto Negroes of the North?
I wouldn't say there's anything that makes it more useful to Southern Negroes. I think it is true that we've had more nonviolent movements in the South because the problem for many years was more crystallized and, in a sense, more visible in the South. We didn't have many civil rights activities on a massive scale in the North until 3 or 4 years ago. So I would say that we just haven't had a chance to experiment.
He's talking about Malcolm X.
Experiment on a broad scale with nonviolence in the northern ghetto. I have the feeling that nonviolence is as applicable and workable in the northern ghetto as it is in the South. Now, there's a larger job there. The frustrations at points are much deeper. The bitterness is deeper. And I think that's because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible in every, at many points, cynicism, because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible, and every Southern Negro knows that he can do things today that he couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Wherein in the North, the Negro sees only retrogress, and he doesn't find it as easy to get his vision centered on his target, the target of opposition, as he does in the South. Consequently, this is made for despair and at many points cynicism, a feeling that you can't win, and it simply means that we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
Well, in the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains. Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's it.
And see, before Martin Luther King continues, that has been an issue, and that goes back to what Malcolm X said about, the Democrats being the fox and the wolf, and the Democrats being the fox, and the situation being one in which once you can no longer identify the problem, it makes it very difficult for people to address it. Makes it very difficult for people to deal with it. And one of the things that has happened, with black people is what I would say is tokenism. Back in the 60s, back in the 50s, the 40s, all black people were discriminated against. But then what was allowed is tokenism. Take a couple black people, put them in some high profile positions, and that'll appease the masses, but the 95% of them will still be locked out, and we're going to keep them locked out. We're just only making small concessions because of rioting that was going on in the 60s, starting with, what was that, 65, 67, 68.
Exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see a target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on, with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier, because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Well, what is it? I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions. People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums.
You notice how he's talking about tangibles. He's talking about the conditions in which people are living. And this is where the civil rights movement was going to transition to before Martin Luther King was assassinated. This is where they didn't want it to go. See, once you start talking about the tangibles, like what ADOS is talking about right now, when you start talking about reparations, when you start talking about the things that you can, feel, see, touch, taste, and smell, that's when, you gots to go. That's when they got to take you out. When you up there talking all that kumbaya, everybody come together, hold hands, have a sweet twinkle of white Jesus in your eye, have the warmness of Jesus in your bosom. You know what I mean? They'll let you talk about that shit all day. But as soon as you start talking about the tangibles, that's when they have a problem. Again, I don't focus on what white supremacy allows me to have access to. They allow us to have access to, the Christianity and the church and Islam and all these magical, religions. But what do they deny us? They deny us access to capital. They deny us access to resources. They deny us access to land. They deny us access to economic opportunities. That is where the power is. That is where the importance is. But see, black people, we've been, distracted, led astray, and we focus on, the intangible things, or at least the previous generations that came before us. I think for, our current generation, we recognize it even more, not just with all the information that sits at our fingertips, but we also recognize it a lot more because right now we're going through essentially two recessions back to back, going into a depression. And notice now all of a sudden, we ain't got no money, but yet they had trillions of dollars just pop up out of thin air when it came to COVID.
And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all.
no, Martin Luther King, you got it wrong. Because according to so many white people, working is good for the soul. Who gives a damn whether you can actually put a roof over your head? Who gives a damn whether you can actually feed and clothe your children and send them to a decent school? Who cares about any of that stuff? It's good for the soul.
All of these things and more.
All of which white people wouldn't tolerate for all but 5 minutes. And see, honestly, what it comes down to is when you get into these conversations about talking about tangibles, sooner or later, what you're going to hear from white folks when you back them into a corner is you're gonna hear that they feel that you don't deserve that. Again, going back to the time machine, the warlock. In the what was the movie? It came out in 2000. It was called The Time Machine. The warlock says it right in the movie. Well, that's their role here. That's their role here, and that's how we're looked at. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself because Martin Luther King's gonna cover all of that. I mean, I really don't need to give this much clarification or commentary because, I mean, you'll see.
They're coming to see them because before the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they're coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger? And then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in 64 and even 65 with the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question.
See, again, getting into the tangibles. See, again, the system of white supremacy will do things that are very symbolic, but not tangible. So again, he's talking about once we get into the housing situation, the same people that voted for the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act, they did not want to deal, with the housing issue. You can change the laws, but you cannot change the hearts and minds of men.
And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But
and then the congressmen of the North, which would be the Democrats, today's Democrats. And this is an ongoing issue. I mean, this is why the ADOS movement and young black people today are talking about no tangibles, no vote. Plain and simple. No tangibles, no vote. The days of smoke and mirrors and symbolisms and like the crap that they did with the Democrats going up there with the kente cloth and all that shit. Like, nah, that's again, notice how they mobilize to do something symbolic, but when it comes to doing things that are actually visceral and tangible, they can't mobilize so quickly. But yet we saw how when it came to the Asian community and what they were going through with COVID, because nobody wanted to eat Chinese food because of everybody's ignorance, thinking that they would get coronavirus from Chinese food. Oh, they came up with a bill real quick.
That's part of the dilemma now. That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is...
And you're going to hear him go into this, but the bottom line on that is that integration did not cost white people anything. Or I should say, desegregation didn't cost white people anything. Again, more symbolism. The crazy thing is you had white folks that, I mean, they were blowing a gasket even over the symbolism, which I would break down into the more clever racist versus the unsophisticated racist. The ones that realize that they can buy time, the intelligent ones, by throwing up symbolisms and gestures and those sort of things, versus the ones that they don't want to make any concessions at all. In large part, usually because they are at the lower rungs of white society and they have an inferiority complex about their position in the totem of the system, the white system.
Much deeper, and I think
so they most certainly don't want to see any concessions being made towards black people who they already feel are inferior to them.
One during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely...
And let me just say this, and I think this is what a lot of people miss. You'll get a lot of people who will say, well, I mean, we're looking at what, 50, 60 years later, and yet we still have these issues. If you go and you find that David Hoffman clip where they're talking about the police brutality, and I think David Hoffman, he's about 75, 78 years old or whatever, and he titled the video debating George Floyd 50 years ago or something like that. But it's I'm losing my train of thought. It's interesting that these conversations they have not changed. They haven't changed at all. Hold on, I'm gonna go back because he said something that just eluded me, but I'm.
And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed.
Yeah, see, I remember what I was going to say. Yeah, in terms of equality, it is about, you cannot have equality or even any sort of parity without talking about the economic component. Again, we integrated or desegregated socially, but not economically. And I don't even understand how you could even remotely have any amount of equality in a capitalist system that the group that was most exploited or most excluded from the system, or absolutely denied because we were nothing more than property. I don't know how you can bring black people up to the level of any level of quote unquote equality with white folks without talking about the economic component. And this is what Reconstruction was essentially supposed to do, but obviously, with the things like the insurrection of 1898 of Wilmington, North Carolina, and the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan rising and then spiking in 1921. All that just basically got wiped out. Because even the people who put together Reconstruction recognized that they could not have a population of black people who came out of slavery with nothing more than the clothes on their back. They needed to be somehow incorporated into society, regardless of whether it was going to be separate but equal. But as we all know, it wasn't separate but equal, which is why Brown versus Board of Education didn't stand.
And this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation.
And that white backlash, coming out of with the Civil Rights Bill being passed, is, in my opinion, akin to the white backlash that we saw with the election of Donald Trump after Barack Obama. Barack Obama, even though he was a biracial man, the symbolism of him being up there and him being married to a black woman, a non-racially ambiguous black woman with, essentially black daughters, it signaled to white people that they were losing power, even though they're not. Even though, again, they still control the vast majority of the wealth and the Fortune 500 companies and all that. It signaled to them that they were losing power and that they had to do something and do something fast. And that was elect Donald Trump.
I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people.
I'm going to play that back again.
For Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people.
See, again, we're talking about tangibles. We're talking about gainful employment. And yet, and still, on some level, I still got some brothers running around, it's not about the money. And I'd make the same argument when it comes to all this gun control that the Democrats are trying to push. It's much easier to sit there and say, ban the handguns, limit magazine capacity, ban assault weapons that, the criminal element in the inner cities don't even use the majority of the time. They use handguns. Ban that as opposed to actually dealing with the poverty, right? Because drugs are already illegal, right? So the drugs are illegal, right? And they're like, oh, well, if we make the guns illegal, then all this will go away. No, again, they do not want to deal with the root of the problem, which is the economic decline. And I understand that is a very complex, multifaceted problem because, one of the issues is the fact that black people don't control the private sector. So how do you get the private sector to invest in black communities and create economic opportunities in black communities? You already know that white folks, they would be jumping up and down screaming, despite the fact that many of the corporations left cities like Detroit and then moved down south to states like Kentucky and Tennessee and what other states are down there? The rural parts of North Carolina, West Virginia, where they had a lot more space and the land was cheaper and they didn't have to pay people unionized wages, which essentially is what made, Detroit a boom town, and, everybody had, a bungalow and, 2 cars and all that, it's so funny because, black people are constantly told that you need to go out there and do with $3 what white people do with $20. Right? And white people, they go out there and they fight for those wages. Again, going back to the classism, how classism comes before racism, because, as far back as you can go, the white elite have not wanted to pay white working class people, let alone pay black people. I have to remind white people all the time, or the working class white people, that you had to fight for livable wages. You had to fight for full medical and dental. You had to fight for holidays and not having to work on Sunday. You had to fight for child labor laws. Think about that. Child labor laws. So if it wasn't for the child labor laws, if you go back and go on Google and pull up images of soot-faced covered little white children and children with missing fingers and all that stuff, again, they had to create laws to force the children into public schools and basically say that employers couldn't hire these children because they needed to be an educated part of the population. White people try to act like they're so much more sophisticated than other groups. Like example, if they talk about the caste system in India, where you have untouchables and people are born into essentially a particular rung of society, and there is no upward mobility. And so they try to act like the Europeans or white people in general have always had this sort of upward mobility, and that each white person is their own person. It's all about hard work and responsibility. And the whole concept of upward mobility is only a concept that is only about 50 to 60 years old. Before that, if your daddy was a coal miner, you were a coal miner, and your kids would be a coal miner, and that's what it was. You tell me what the difference between that and being an untouchable in India is. Being at the lowest, rung of society in India is, and versus, being a poor working class, white person. I used to pay them in script. If it was any better than slavery, it was only marginally better, of a situation. But, again, the goal is to divide and conquer. Do not let the poor working class whites and the poor working class blacks see their commonality of interest. Create separation, create segregation, make the white folks feel that because of their whiteness that they are still, vanguards of the white community and members of the dominant society. And, as a result, that they must always fight to preserve, the system of white supremacy, even if it only minimally, and I mean minimally, benefits them. Because, again, the fear mongering comes in. Oh, if the niggas take over, blah, 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 this and that's going to happen. They're going to, steal your wife and fuck your daughters and all that stuff. And, that's what they're going to push out there. It's fear tactics.
It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums.
And let me say this about integration. I think that there was a mistake made in integration, a miscalculation. I think if the conversation was going to be about economics, then it needed to be about economics with black people talking about economics within their own black communities, like what we had with, a Tulsa, Oklahoma, or a Rosewood, Florida. That's what the conversation needed to be, about. The issue with integration, and people say, well, why is it black people always want to be around white people or have what white people have? And it's because white people have everything. I mean, they had all of the wealth. If in other words, integration was the fastest way to have access to the white infrastructure. If white people were going to, say, okay, well, we want black people to stay over there. If white people were going to write black people a check, then we would have had a different conversation, and maybe integration wouldn't have been on the table. But again, integration was one of those symbolic solutions. It didn't actually do anything. It didn't cost white people anything. Integration cost white people nothing. You see? And yet black people integrated into white society. Okay, now you can sit at the front of the bus. Okay, now you can eat at their diner. But, at the end of the day, what did that really do? All it did was make white people wealthier. The same way that, feminism, all it did was make the bankers wealthier. Because now it takes 2 incomes to support a household in 2020. Not just 1 income. It takes 2 incomes. Now, many women don't have the luxury or the option to be a stay-at-home mother, despite the fact that, in the past, a man could get a job working at GM, probably one of them unionized jobs, and support a whole family of 4, no problem. Those days are essentially gone, you see. And, it's like, there was a point I was going to make about, it's like, it's like if you look at the Moulin Rouge, we've talked about the Moulin Rouge before. The Moulin Rouge was a casino that was way off of the strip, in the 50s, I believe, that black people came up with because they were excluded from what white people were doing. And I've talked about this before, this whole aspect of we don't want you around us, but then when black people go off and they create something for themselves, and they're, independent, and then the white people don't have control over them, or they don't know what they're doing, or they recognize that, hey, they're making money over there. Like, in other words, black people's money is just as green. It's just like the numbers game, with the Italian mafia. That was something that black people were doing. They were running the numbers game. And then once the Italian mafia discovered how much black people were making off of the numbers game, they switched over to the numbers game. Same thing with selling drugs. How long did the Italian mafia say, oh, we're not getting involved in drugs, blah, 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 blah. How many mob bosses were taken out because they got themselves involved in drugs, because the black people were involved in the drugs. And I'm talking about underground illegal activity, right? After, all this stuff was, dumped in the black community. Right? Many people saw it as an opportunity to make money where there was a vacuum, where there were no, economic opportunities. And so they went that route. But again, like I talked about before with the white guy that, said, my father said that, what the problem with the black community is? And I entertained it. I was like, well, what's the problem with the black community? The problem is that black people, they don't take care of their own community. I was like, all right, you know what? You're right. Black people don't take care of their own community. I'm going to demonstrate some serious personal responsibility, and, we need to have our own supermarkets and our own schools and our own this and our own that. I went through a whole list. And by the time I got done rattling off my list, black having their own banks and everything, he was like, wait a minute. He was like, that sounds like reverse racism. And I want you to think about that. So you chastise us because we're not handling our own business. You shouldn't have to use my stuff. You should be able to, operate independently on your own and have your own stuff. Then when black people actually go off and they do that, then the claim is reverse racism because white people feel some type of way because now they're excluded from what black people went off, and created. The Moulin Rouge was not open for more than 11 months. I think it was 11 months exactly that it closed. And even now, they totally eliminated the last remnants of the Moulin Rouge. You had Sammy Davis Jr. who couldn't stay at the Sands. And so they would have to go down to the Moulin Rouge. And, the Rat Pack, non-racist Frank Sinatra. And who was the other person in the Rat Pack? Was it Howard Dean? Who was in the Rat Pack? Who was the other guy that was in the Rat Pack? I forget his name. But anyway, they would go and stay at the Sands. And the Sands was jumping. They essentially, were integrated. So again, when it's funny how white people do this sort of like where they try to accuse black people of doing the same thing that they do, but in reality, black people don't do that. I mean, you even see this when it comes to hip hop. If you look at hip hop, hip hop essentially you have all these white rappers and they're embraced, and then you have the issues of cultural appropriation. But notice the difference between when Eminem came into hip hop versus Lil Nas trying to get into country music. And then, all the hoopla that surrounded oh, that's not really country music, that's jungle bunny music and all this other stuff. Notice the difference in energy, right? But yet, black people are the ones that are really racist. Let them tell it.
And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the star Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we get for decency, which characterized the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is...
He's talking about tangibles. In other words, translation, a struggle from symbolism of being recognized as men or women or human beings to a struggle of tangibles.
Where we're getting the resistance because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor, and from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we're getting the resistance because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
And this is why I try to tell black people why white people should never be allowed to be the definers of your moral compass. Again, they have no intention to desegregate, to integrate, to bring about real equality or real tangible, change. There's no intention. The symbolism, the smart ones, yeah, they'll allow that to happen. But the dumb ones, no, they're going to rant and rave and all the stuff that you see, and the quickness with which they will find something wrong with your movement or what you're doing, or the type of different responses that you'll see from people who are sick and tired of being sick and tired. I understand both aspects of people saying that we have to have a plan, we have to have a goal and orientation, it has to be properly executed. But I also understand the people that are like, well, if you have no tension, burn this motherfucker down. Plain and simple. If you have no intention, if you're at the end of the day, all you're going to say is, I don't think you deserve X, Y, and Z. You need to accept your lot in life. You're beneath me, and that's all there is to it. And I have no intention of rectifying this situation. I have no responsibility, which white people do have a responsibility to the conditions in which black people have existed in America. They have a responsibility. African Americans did not come here by choice. They were brought here. And then even beyond, slavery, African Americans paid their dues in blood, fighting for every war this nation has ever had, believing in the ideas and the concepts of true integration. Being the idea of being truly incorporated into America, and this whole aspect that white people try to sell you today of this, let bygones be bygones and move forward and just forget the past and all that other stuff. And honestly, I truly believe that probably could have happened at some point. But for some strange reason, white people are always feeling some type of way whenever they see black people who they see as their inferior, shoulder to shoulder with them. It always falls short of actually presenting effective and viable solutions. Amos Wilson talked about this, with the schools, in New York, when he gave that speech about integration. They keep telling you about manhood programs and education. They keep coming up with all these, educational plans and programs and whatnot. And he said, let's paint the picture and let's paint the scenario that black people somehow, just started getting straight A's all over the place. And they were successful, and they rightfully, in a meritocracy, earned the position. What you would start to see is the same thing that you saw in that article, Ghost of White People Past, which was about the Asian community. You would start to see white people say, I don't care how good a grades you got. These jobs is for white folks. But see, since, again, we have this issue of the culture that is due to prolonged exposure to poverty, and how people, the conditions are not conducive to producing those type of people and that type of orientation, right? We fail out before we get there. So that saves white people from ever having to really engage in those nasty conversations where they would be exposed, or it would be exposed, that they have no intentions of moving black people from their position of servitude or subordination to being shoulder to shoulder with white folks. This is why when black people move into predominantly white communities, despite how much they've done the right thing, got the education, landed a great job or whatever, they start seeing too many of us in a particular community, they start feeling some type of way.
Do you think white people in this country, and I'm talking about non-segregationists, people devoid or thinking they're devoid of racism, do you have any idea of what they want the Negro to be in America?
Well, it depends on the level that we are talking here, because I think you have to make a distinction between the people who are genuinely and absolutely committed in the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they're in a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. It's a kind of installment plan for equality.
Again, kicking the can down the road. I'm going to back that up. Listen to what he's saying. A very small minority of white people are actually committed to equality, to racial harmonious equality.
In the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they're in a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. It's a kind of installment plan for equality, and they are always looking for an excuse to go but so far.
Why are they looking for the excuse? What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it.
So what he's saying here is he's saying that in order to justify slavery, basically white people had to remove black people's humanity. And essentially they never put it back. Once slavery was over, they say, hey, okay, you guys are not people, you're not humans. Okay, we're going to use you as chattel labor. Okay, remove their humanity so that we don't feel guilty about it. They're not people, so don't feel guilty about whipping the slave. Feel the same way that you do, in kicking a dog. The irony part is white people like dogs more than they like black people, right? But that's how they orient, right? So you dehumanize the people to justify using them as an object, using them as a tool. But then after you're done using them as a tool, white supremacy never put back the humanity. White supremacy never put back these group of people, are people. They just freed the slaves and said, they're still not people. They're still less than. And that's essentially what he's talking about here.
The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here and changed, treated in very inhuman fashion. And this led to the thingification of the Negro. So
what he's saying is, I wish he used a better word. What he's saying is the thingification. It's really the dehumanization. And like I said, the humanization of black people was never put back.
He was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma. And that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land.
He's talking about the Homestead Act.
In the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base.
Tangibles. This is why Martin Luther King was killed. This is why he was killed. When he was up there talking about Kumbaya, everybody come together, hold hands, sweet twinkle of Jesus in your eye, all that shit. When he was talking all that, they left his ass alone. They loved him because what was the alternative? Malcolm X, who was basically telling black people to arm themselves and fight for their salvation by any means necessary. Like Magneto. That's why it's so interesting with Stan Lee and the whole X-Men. The whole aspect of the X-Men is about black people and black people's struggle in America. And Martin Luther King is Professor Xavier, with the nonviolence approach, the peaceful approach, the, join hands with the European and everything else like that. And Malcolm X is Magneto. And we all know Magneto's position, in the Marvel comic universe. Now, the funny thing is, yes, both of them, in other words, Malcolm X, before he died in 1965, came closer to Martin Luther King's position. And Martin Luther King essentially moved closer to Malcolm X's position, before they died respectively. And that's essentially what you're seeing here. And then the Black Panthers, they took it a step further, and then they were also neutralized via COINTELPRO. If you go and you listen to what Fred Hampton was saying, if you listen to what Huey P. Newton was saying, they were talking about economics. They were talking about black people being independent, self-sufficient, and controlling the means of production. Okay, again, many people, I know, one person in particular, and this is their quote. They thought that these online conversations were going to continue where the civil rights movement kicked off, but then we got distracted with all the conversations about the gender war and all that other stuff, which needed to be resolved because a lot of I'd say the vast majority of the problems that we have are directly connected to the black man's economic impotence in relationship to his woman and his children and his household as a whole. So our interpersonal relationships are busted up, and you have this whole situation of single motherhood and ghettos and and lack of economic infrastructure, economic base, which is directly tied to the financial impotence of black men and the denial of economic opportunities and capital to the black man.
And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time.
I think that was a brilliant point. Oh yeah. You're free. You're free. You know, to the freaking to the elements. Again, black people leaving slavery with nothing but the clothes on their back. You know, and the crazy thing is, just, again, you get people that, black people never accomplished anything. Black people accomplished far more underneath segregation than they ever did underneath integrate or desegregation. I keep slipping up saying integration because we didn't integrate. You know, because black people were essentially forced to. And they were left alone, and they were left to their own devices in their own communities. And then you had white people who, they, felt some type of way. And what did they do? They go into black neighborhoods, black communities, and burnt them down to the ground based on the slightest infraction, the slightest offense. How dare these Negroes, which I've already talked about, really kicked off after World War I, after you had black men that went off and fought and died, for this country, and saw that white men bleed too, saw that those Germans bleed. And then they're going to come home and have to deal with some white person talking about, boy, you need to not look me in the eye. And that soldier's sitting there thinking, I stabbed a German in the bayonet and looked in his eyes as he died. But yet you got white folks, you need to not look me in the eye, or, step onto the street when you see me walking, all that other stuff. Yeah, there was a lot of black soldiers that came back, and a lot of black soldiers that got killed at home, not abroad, not in the theater of war, but when they came home, because, they had a completely different mindset. You have young men that go off to war, and, they go off to war 17, 18 years old. And when they come back, they're a man. Like they've seen what the vast majority of men in society will never see and should hope never to see. They come back with a completely different mindset. They're not coming back with that step and fetch and grovel after they enter the theater of war. That's why some of your more white supremacist intellectuals did not want to see black men join the armed forces. They did not want to see black men be disciplined and mobilized, in the U.S. Armed Forces, because they knew that it was going to change their mindset, just as it would change anybody's mindset, any young man's mindset, white, black, or otherwise. They knew that. White people know the psychology of conditions and environments and whatnot, which is why they always go out of their way to make sure that their children are in the best environment, only to turn around and tell black people that environments are irrelevant.
And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression, and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
You know who said the same point? Muhammad Ali made a very similar point when he talked about, you break my legs and then you call me cripple. Very similar point.
Apart from wanting to live better, which all of us want to do, to raise one's children in a better way, to be better, does the Negro in America know what he wants to be?
I'm convinced that almost every Negro in this country, other than those who have been so scarred by the system that they've become pathological in the process, and we all have to battle with pathology, and nobody really knows what it means.
I'm going to back that up because this is very important. And this goes back to what, myself and Captain Solo have talked about in reference to prolonged exposure to poverty, the conditions in which, what poverty does, to the mind, to people who have existed in those conditions. It's not like black people, are in situations of poverty or generational poverty and come out unscathed.
Almost every Negro in this country, other than those who have been so scarred by the system that they've become pathological in the process, and we all have to battle with pathology, and nobody really knows what it means to be a Negro unless one can really experience it. And I know we all have to battle with this constant drain of a feeling of nobodiness. But in spite of this, I think the vast majority of Negroes in this country know that they want to be people, they want to be men, they want equality, period. It just boils down to that. And we haven't been able to be people. We haven't been men because of all of the conditions that we've lived with and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing, in the economic area, or in schools, or in the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto, and all of the problems of closed doors and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all know, basically, that...
Hold on, I'm going to back it up, because this highlights the redlining issue.
We face in the ghetto and all of the problems of founding conditions, whether it's in housing, in the economic area, or in schools, or in the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto, and all of the problems of closed doors and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all know, basically, that we want to be men. We want to be persons judged not on the basis of the color of our skin, but on the basis of the content of our character.
But you know that many young Negroes don't want anything that smacks of the American white middle class. But do they want something that smacks of whatever is the black middle class? Or do they just not want bourgeois values, which after all are the basis of this democracy?
Well, I think we have to see what they are saying. I would be the first to agree that integration does not mean giving up everything that has an Afro-American taint, so to speak, a background. I think there are certain unique things within any culture and certain cultural patterns that when you get to the process of amalgamation can really lift the whole culture. And it seems to me that integration at its best is the opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. I think the other thing that we've got to see...
I'm going to pause it right there because this is one of the things that ends up presenting as a problem with the prolonged exposure to poverty. I've had to explain to quite a few people that if you ever fix the black community, many of the things that black people claim that they love about the black community would not exist. Many of the aspects of, hip hop or hip hop battles, or, what is rapped about in hip hop, that whole scene with, Mekhi Phifer and Paid in Full, where he talked about, I love the game. There's a lot of people who love the game, right? They love the streets. They love street culture and all of that, right? And we know the negatives that come out of the street culture when we look at, these homicide rates and everything else that goes on in the black community, Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, right? And if you fixed all of that, I try to tell black folks, all the time, I'm like, truth be told, we be closer to the very group of people or groups of people that we consider lame. Because when you're in, I mean, when people say, "Oh, I went to the school of hard knocks," well, what does that mean? That means you struggled. That means you went through trials and tribulations. Which, don't get me wrong, growing up with a silver spoon in your mouth doesn't make you. The issue is it doesn't. If you haven't had anything challenge you, right, then you're not truly capable of adapting to change. It's like you're not being challenged, right? But a lot of people take that challenge aspect too far, to the point where they start acting like there's more benefits to growing up with a broken foundation or a dysfunctional foundation than growing up with a solid foundation, right? And if that were the case, well, then why don't white people swiftly switch places with us, and then they can tell us about the awesomeness of growing up in the ghetto and broken foundations, and how that makes them a stronger individual and superior to black people than growing up with a silver spoon in their mouth. And I say the same thing to other black people who want to criticize and chastise, their kinfolk or brethren, other black folks, that were able to slip through the cracks. Right. The goal is better conditions. And better conditions, and you can see this with pretty much every entertainer, all the children of all the gangster entertainers that you want to speak about, all of them are soft. All of them grew up with silver spoons in their mouth. From Ice Cube's kids to I don't even know if Ja Rule has any kids, but just start listing off the name of all the rappers and all the entertainers that you could possibly think of, with maybe the exception of DMX's son, because he has an estranged relationship with his father. But I'm saying, all these other, Dr. Dre's son and all these other kids, they grew up a life of privilege. And the only one that I've seen that actually showcases it and embraces it is Jaden Smith. All the rest of them, they want to, I want to rap like my daddy. And I'm like, your dad grew up in the streets. You grew up in Beverly Hills. I'm like, ain't nobody gonna, and nobody who's from the streets is particularly going to listen to that. And so again, you end up with people who, they I guess I'll use the word that Martin Luther King used, which is, they embrace the pathology that is the byproduct of prolonged exposure to poverty. And once you embrace it, once you're locked into it, I don't know how much of a solution there is. It's the same thing I say about these women who have the wrong orientation. Once your condition becomes a belief system, and you believe that condition that essentially you were put in, or your people were put in generations ago, once you believe that now defines you, or that now has value, then you become your own worst enemy, because now any attempts to try to pull you out of that condition, you will see as an assassination on your identity, an assassination on your lifestyle or that which you value, despite the fact that the conditions are horrendous and very problematic. And then this is where you get people that, they come up with new terms and ideas like being ghetto fabulous and stuff like that, but it all comes with its drawbacks, because at the end of the day, there are aspects of, anti-white supremacy where black people end up rejecting white supremacy so hard that they reject not just the white structure, but all structure. And then you can see how, when trying to create and establish an economic base, or try to have a community that at the very least can compete in the economic marketplace with other patriarchal capitalistic structures, you're going to have a problem doing that with the people who don't believe in authority, don't believe in structure, don't believe in anything that even remotely looks like the white system. And that ends up being a problem. And Patrick Moynihan, I remember he pointed this out in his what was it, the something of the Negro that he had in 1965. What was it? What was that called? It was something, I forget what the title of the piece was called, but he talked about that. You can't have a group that operates completely differently from the dominant group and then thinks that it's going to be able to compete on any level with the dominant group.
Is that these young people are saying that there must be a revolution of values in our country. As Jimmy Baldwin said on one occasion, what advantage is there in being integrated into a burning house? And I feel that there is a need for a revolution of values in America, because some of the values that presently exist are certainly out of line with the values and the idealistic structure that brought our nation into being. Unfortunately, we haven't been true to these ideals, and many of the values of so-called white middle-class society are values that need to be reviewed and re-evaluated, and in a real sense, they need to be changed. So I think the young people in the Negro community who are raising these questions are raising some very profound questions about our total society. In other words, they are saying that there must be a restructuring of the architecture of our society where values are concerned. And with this, I would agree with. So in the quest for integration, I think we can offer our whole nation something, because there are three evils in our nation. It's not only racism, but economic exploitation of poverty would be one, and then militarism. And I think in a sense, and in a very real sense, these three are tied inextricably together, and we aren't going to get rid of one without getting rid of the other.
When you stood on the Lincoln Memorial that day in August, 63, and you said, "I had a dream," did that dream envision that you could see a war in Asia preventing the federal government doing for the Negroes, preventing the society doing for the Negroes that which you think had to be done?
No, I didn't envision that then. I must confess that that period was a great period of hope for me. And I'm sure for many others all across the nation, many of the Negroes who had about lost hope, saw a solid decade of progress in the South. And in 1954, which was, 64.
Basically, what they're talking about is the start of the Vietnam War and how the Vietnam War is essentially distracted away from, the civil rights movement gains. And arguably, the very much same thing could be said about COVID-19. Before COVID-19, we were already talking about tangibles. We were already talking about no tangibles, no vote. Right? We were already talking about reparations for slavery, but way before COVID-19. And now COVID-19 is here. The world is collapsing, this, that, and the third. People are leaving New York. Again, we once again get tossed to the back burner. Right? Soon as black people start getting loud, I understand COVID-19, the global pandemic, that's one thing, but any excuse whatsoever to deflect away from the responsibility that white people have to black America is what they're going to throw up.
1963, 9 years after the Supreme Court's decision to be in the March on Washington, meant a great deal. It was a high moment, a great watershed moment. But I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But
Now I want you to keep in mind what he said. He's saying this in, what was that, 11 months? So this must be 1967, sometime in 1967 or late 1966, because he died 11 months after this. But I want you to keep in mind that it is now 2020, and none of this has changed. The economic disparity has not changed. The segregation, has not changed. I mean, if anything, America has become more segregated. It's one of the reasons why I don't subscribe to Christianity and white Jesus, because 12 o'clock noon on Sunday is the most segregated time in America. It's the most segregated time in America. Black people go to black churches, white people go to white churches. That's what it is. Okay? Now, some people will say, well, people are more comfortable, around their own people. And I don't doubt that people are comfortable around their own people. But you can't ignore, the racist history in America of segregation. That would be one thing if we didn't start off on the wrong foot. But America started off on the wrong foot.
But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments.
He's having doubts. That's what he's saying. He's having doubts because he's doing the social math. He's looking at it for what it is. It's like, y'all, okay, we Civil Rights Bill, Voting Rights Act, but anytime we get to anything tangible, y'all start, dodging and ducking and all that other stuff. We can move up the field when it comes to things that don't cost you anything. But when it comes to the actual tangible things that are needed and necessary to rectify the problem, oh no, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't make that happen.
And I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead. And some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go, and that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of our nation.
Dr. King, even if there had not been a war in Asia, would you still not have had this nightmare insofar as the Negro movement for equality then touched on two things that the white community holds sacred, their children and their property?
Oh, I have no doubt that we would have encountered great difficulties, great problems of resistance if the war had not been in existence, so that I'm not going to say that all of our problems will be solved if the war in Vietnam is ended. But I do say that the war makes it infinitely more difficult to deal with these problems. When a nation becomes obsessed with the guns of war, it loses its social perspective, and programs of social uplift suffer. This is just a fact of history, so that we do face.
Keep in mind that many of the ghettos were cleared out of young black men who were sent off to Vietnam at this time. So instead of being out in the streets protesting, they were sent off to war.
Many more difficulties as a result of the war. It's much more difficult to really arouse a conscience during a time of war. I noticed the other day, some weeks ago, a Negro was shot down in Chicago, and it was a clear case of police brutality. That was on page 30 of the paper, but on page 1 at the top was 780 Viet Cong killed. That is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience. It strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence. And it strengthened the military-industrial complex of our country, and it's made our job much more difficult, because I think we can go along with some programs, if we didn't have this war on our hands, that would cause people to adjust to new developments, just as they did in the South. They said they'd never ride the bus with us, blood would flow in the streets, they wouldn't go to school, and all of these things. But when people came to see that they had to do it because the law insisted, they finally adjusted. And I think white people all over this country will adjust once the nation makes it clear that in schools and housing, we've got to learn to live together as brothers. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rates, so to speak. Didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodation.
There it is.
That we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rates, so to speak. Didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance.
I'm going to go back and play that again.
That we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rates, so to speak. Didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
Yep. You can't get rid of it without costing money. Period. You're not going to get around the money. You're not going to get around me when it comes to the money. It's all about the money. And that's why I don't understand all these black folks out here that want to be anti-capitalism and all that other stuff. And again, money is the medium of exchange. I don't care what society you want to operate in. There's going to be a medium of exchange, and that is going to be the tool that you use to get things done. And again, see, this is the joke. This is the joke. You know, of getting us to focus on symbolism, getting us to focus. This is why I don't even listen to black people that sit there and want to talk about how racist Donald Trump is. If Donald Trump signed a multi-trillion-dollar, billion-dollar bill, you know, that was specifically tailored to the black community, I would vote for Donald Trump. Not that that's going to happen, but I would vote for Donald Trump. And he could go up there and he could say nigga, 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 as he's signing it, and I wouldn't give a shit. See, I focus on the means to an end. I don't focus on, you know, the nonsensical stuff, the emotional stuff. That's where we get lost. I'm gonna play that again. I'm gonna play it again.
That we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rates, so to speak. Didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks.
And that's it. That's all of it. And that's pretty much, I've said everything I need to say. You know, it comes down to the money, and you know, that's what it's about. You're not going to get rid of poverty without talking about the money. You're not going to, you know, fix black households without black men being gainfully employed. I don't care how you want to dice it up. Okay? You need to have men who are gainfully employed and financially ahead of their women enough so that not only can they work together and make moves, but so that the woman, recognizes, the man is head of the household and respects him as such and as somebody who is capable of getting things done in the community. Without that, you got nothing. So, like I said, white people do have a responsibility to black America as much as they want to sit there and they ignore it and fight it. Taking on responsibility does not mean that, like an individual person is guilty of any particular crime. It just simply means that you're taking on the responsibility. And since we love to talk about generational wealth and legacies and group economics and what people are leaving behind, for their children and whatnot, then we have to recognize the responsibilities that come along with that. You can't just have generational benefits, but then none of the generational sins are transferable. Think about that. Oh, we can transfer the wealth, but not the sins. I mean, that's tantamount to what the corporations did in the 2009 financial crisis. By what did they do? Privatize gains while socializing losses. You see? And like I said, at the very beginning about, Christianity and Jesus. Oh, Jesus, he can die for the sins of the Father. Right? I mean, excuse me, the sins of mankind. Jesus can die for the sins of mankind. Right? But people got a problem with dying for the sins of the Father or paying for the sins of the Father. Right? But if you look at the system of white supremacy, even with that Swedish girl, or whatever she is, the one that was talking about the ozone layer and the earth and greenhouse gases and all that other stuff, right? It really does seem like as much as white folks put their children first, they have no issue leaving them to sin and just simply kicking the can down the road. And sooner or later, that sin, it explodes, like what you saw with 9/11. Sooner or later, that sin, spills out onto the streets, like what you see with George Floyd and all these issues, these conversations about, police brutality. And so I don't know how white folks want to handle it. All I know is if the attitude is just simply, fuck you and we ain't gonna do shit about it and it is what it is, and I'm like, yeah, well, people are gonna be out there in the streets like they are, tearing shit up. That's what you're gonna see. You're not gonna see a situation where people just accept their lot in life and just go home and just allow, the injustices to go on. They're gonna do like that wolf in that experiment. press, and that dog came in there and tore. That dog said, "Fuck the button and the plank it came on." That shit. Excuse me. It wasn't the dog. It was the wolves. The dog walked away, but the wolf wasn't having it. And it's amazing that even animals can understand fairness. Animals, monkeys, wolves, whatever they do the experiments on, the animals understand what is fair and what is just and what is righteous. This is, in other words, it is a basic concept that even animals can understand. But yet, we keep kicking the can down the road, and America doesn't want to deal with this problem. The system of white supremacy doesn't want to deal with this problem. Like I've said before, either black people should have been purged or you should have sent them back to Africa. You gotta think about that. They ain't even want to do that. It would have cost white folks way less to just take all the Africans. Okay, yeah, we used them and everything. We're gonna send them back. They ain't want to do that. Even that was too much. But anyway, this video is already long enough. That's all I gotta say. That's my video. SWP out. And I would highly advise to download this video, because I can pretty much guarantee that eventually YouTube is either going to block this video or take it down, because there's just too much truth in it. So anyway, that's my video. SWP out.